I was trained to maintain control in any situation. Sudden storms, system failures, the watchful eyes of heads of state. But nothing prepared me for the moment a single verse from the Quran, heard at 40,000 feet through my headset, pierced everything I thought was unshakable. It wasn't a technical malfunction or an external attack. It was a fracture from within that showed me there was an authority greater than any earthly power. My name is Adrian Wells. I'm 50 years old and I live in the United States. For decades, my life was defined by relentless schedules, covert missions, and the responsibility of carrying not just an aircraft, but the trust of the White House in my hands. I served on presidential routes, attended meetings where the fates of whole peoples were decided, and grew used to living on the edge between glory and pressure. But it was in the silence of night flights, when the stars seemed closer than the earth, that I realized my true course was changing, and no flight manual explained it. Before I continue with my story of conversion, write in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know to which countries this account is reaching. The night seemed perfect. No headwinds, clear skies, every navigation system confirming parameters as expected. From the outside, I was the picture of technical calm, uniform neat, hands steady on the controls, eyes fixed on the instruments. But inside, something was expanding in a way that went beyond any flight manual. The cockpit, always my realm of control and routine, suddenly felt bigger than the whole planet. It was as if, beyond piloting, I was being piloted by something that invited me to look beyond the radars. The first thread appeared on the left, subtle but persistent, a light that didn't match any registered aircraft and seemed to choose to fly with us, adjusting its speed as if it had awareness. There was no plausible explanation in the route calculations or weather reports, but one detail unsettled me more than the phenomenon itself. Only I seemed to notice it. The co-pilot, the cabin crew, everyone looked at the same space and saw nothing. I, however, couldn't ignore what was accompanying me. The second thread was even more intimate. In the surgical silence of the cockpit, a sound came through my headset. It wasn't a tower instruction, not interference noise. It was a clear, measured voice reciting something I didn't comprehend word for word, but that hit me as if it had been recorded inside me long ago. The cadence of that speech didn't seem to come from outside, but from the very space around me. When asked, the crew only confirmed silence. I, on the other hand, felt as if each syllable were an invitation to land within myself. And the third thread may have been the most painful, memories that returned unbidden. Cold reports that categorized human losses as collateral damage. Maps marking targets without ever showing the faces living in them. Inside that perfect cockpit, where everything ran in sync, I realized that the real mismatch wasn't in the instruments, but in me. My mind revisited numbers I had once accepted without question, and now they came accompanied by voices I had never heard. The voices of those who paid the price for missions I carried out without hesitation. These three threads, the light, the voice, and the memory, began to weave into a net no checklist could control. I kept performing each procedure precisely, but at the same time, a file opened inside me. A file with no secret classification, not stored on the base computers, and not closable with a simple end of mission. It was personal, deep, and, in a way, inevitable. There, in mid-flight, I understood that my cockpit wasn't only the command center of a presidential aircraft, it was also the place where my conscience, for the first time, took up more space than the rest of the world. We were heading to Ramstein on one of those routes where every detail is measured, reviewed, and monitored in advance. It was a starless night. The window looked like a fresh black painted canvas. The only sound was the steady drone of the engines, and all systems indicated absolute normality. Then suddenly, something tore through the routine, as casually as someone turning on a light in a dark room. On the left, a golden luminosity took shape. It wasn't a scattered glare or a reflection of cockpit lights, but a defined, dense body the size of an entire hangar. And most intriguing, that massive light didn't merely appear. It aligned itself with the wing as if aware of the speed I maintained. No alarm sounded, no tower message was transmitted, and the radar showed no nearby traffic. Officially, the sky was clear. Yet before my eyes, the void took on the outline of a presence. My first instinct, trained by years of military discipline, was to seek logic. Atmosphere, satellite, some kind of secret test. But the more I watched, the further explanations drifted away. That gold didn't behave like a physical phenomenon. It didn't flicker, oscillate, or disappear only to reappear further ahead. It remained there, steady, matching every movement of the aircraft, like someone choosing to walk side by side without hurry to part ways. I called the co-pilot, who looked at the same point and described only darkness. His puzzled expression, combined with the total absence of instrument signals, reinforced the impression that this event didn't belong to the realm of technique. I was alone in the vision. But if it was a hallucination, why didn't it seem fragile? Why, when I faced that light, did I feel as if I were the one being observed? At that moment, the sensation grew into something larger than a sight. The gold pulsed in a measured rhythm, like living calligraphy drawn in the void, as if invisible letters were forming before me. They weren't symbols I could decipher, but the cadence conveyed meaning. Not threat, not alarm, but something like an invitation. And for the first time in a long while, I switched off the urge inside me to justify every detail. I didn't log it in the flight log, didn't report it to the tower. I simply recorded it in memory with the clarity of someone who knows it's not any ordinary detail. From that night on, I understood that I hadn't found something unusual, that presence had found me. The light hadn't appeared by chance. It chose to show itself when everything around screamed routine. And rather than fear, what remained was the conviction that I had been noticed by something that transcends radars, protocols, and titles. I continued the route to Ramstein with an impeccable checklist, but the trip had changed. It was no longer just transport for political authority. It was, secretly, the start of a personal crossing. While everyone slept in the rear compartment, I understood in silence that I had received my first sign, not as an external threat, but as an intimate mark. Someone, or something, knew I was watching and had answered my gaze. The days continued heavy with formalities. Arrivals at air bases were greeted with aligned red carpets, meticulously prepared speeches, and reports that repeated words like stability and regional security. The routine demanded impeccable composure, straight posture, wrinkle-free uniform, ceremonial execution of every gesture. But behind the facade, something no longer fit. In the folders that reached the cockpit, tables showed targets with mathematical precision. They were maps treated like chess pieces, where each move resulted in columns of numbers. Only for me, those numbers began to take the shape of streets, houses, families. The cold language of the documents spoke of collateral damage. But in my mind, images surfaced of children crossing corridors of smoke, of cities I had seen from above, turning into unrecognizable fragments. At those moments, my automatic response was to adjust my tie and regain focus. After all, that was what was expected of me, neutrality. But that gesture, which once symbolized control, began to reveal the opposite. Each well-tied knot hid internal knots that multiplied without end. The discipline that had shaped me no longer silenced the questions that arose every time I looked at the classified attachments. I started using the back of my emergency card, the one I carry for possible in-flight failures, as a secret space to vent. There, among technical instructions and contact numbers, I scribbled phrases I didn't dare speak aloud. What if the real mission is to disarm pride, not the enemy? Or, what if security without justice is just technical noise disguised as order? The paper, which should have reminded me what to do in case of mechanical failure, became the silent witness to the moral failure I could no longer ignore. It was a painful contrast. The uniform turned me into a representative of order, guardian of an entire system's trust. But my soul no longer saluted the same truths I once repeated without hesitation. Between palaces and control rooms, I performed every duty with precision. But conviction had started to crack. Those fissures were not visible to others. From the outside, I remained the pilot who smiled in official photos, greeted authorities, and reported figures with confidence. Inside, the silence grew with every flight, as if the engine of conscience were revving at a frequency only I could hear. Discipline still sustained the appearance, but it couldn't contain the widening of the questions. In that period, I discovered that the heaviest burden to carry wasn't the uniform, nor the daily protocols. It was the dissonance between what my body represented and what my heart could no longer sustain. The uniform still labeled me officer, but each hidden confession reminded me loyalty to orders was beginning to give way to something greater, something that didn't fit into reports or military jargon. That night in Andrews, the hangar smelled of kerosene and cold metal. I still wore the rigid posture of someone who had just completed a presidential flight, but my body was tired. While I gathered my flight folder, I noticed an unusual detail. Among the checklists and reports lay a small, plain-covered book, almost hidden. No notes, no slip of paper. It simply rested there, as if it had always been part of the baggage. I recognized the discreet handwriting of the dedication in English. Read calmly. Nothing more. One glance was enough to identify its origin. A Muslim technician from the hangar who'd always greeted me with dignity over the years, even though we rarely exchanged words. There was no sermon, no explicit invitation. Just that silent gesture, like handing someone an extra tool they don't yet know they'll need. I took the volume to my quarters, at first with no intention of opening it. For days, it sat on the table like a strange object, out of place among medals and folders. But on an insomnia-filled night, after a string of missions that left my chest heavy, I reached for it. As I flipped through, a verse jumped out at me. Say, He is Allah, the One. Just 4 words, direct, without ornament. Yet the simplicity cut through my strongest defenses. It was as if all military rhetoric, all political speeches, all reports with pages and pages of justification had been reduced to dust before such a clean truth. The sensation was physical. Suddenly I felt my breathing change. For years, I had lived in pressurized cockpits, used to relying on oxygen masks at impossible altitudes. In that moment, however, it felt like I was breathing without aid, as if the air came from a source with no limit. It wasn't a forced metaphor. My chest literally expanded, as if released from a silent confinement. The phrase seemed to pierce the fuselage of my being. I, who had learned to distrust anything that couldn't be measured or tested, was now surrendered to something impossible to quantify. Allah, the One. No need to prove it. No rounds of conferences. Just presence. I spent hours staring at those lines, unable to turn the page. The verse echoed internally, cycling over and over. Each repetition seemed to peel away another layer of the hull I had built over decades. The armor of discipline, the shell of pride, the casing of professional vanity. None of it withstood the impact of that simplicity. The next morning in Andrews, my routine proceeded as usual. Briefing, pre-flight inspection, rigid posture before the authorities. But something had already changed. While answering technical questions, a gentle voice resonated inside me, reminding, He is Allah, the One. No matter the complexity of protocol or the pressure of hierarchy, that phrase had carved a new point of reference within me. That day, I understood that the true depressurization did not happen in the cockpit, but in the heart. After years seeking security in system redundancies and contingency plans, I had found a certainty that required no backup. It was as if the entire universe had been condensed into 4 words, and within them I discovered room to finally breathe whole. This first contact was neither a final decision nor an immediate conversion. It was merely the opening of a shell, a crack that let light in. But it was enough to change course. I knew how to pilot in any weather condition, but there I realized the true flight was only beginning, and it didn't depend on altitude or an approved route. It was an inward flight, awakened by a sentence that needed no explanation because it carried its very essence. The night was calm, clear skies, and the invisible sea of the Atlantic below. The cockpit maintained that surgical silence, broken only by routine checks between me and the co-pilot. Everything was within technical normalcy, instruments synchronized, communication clean, nothing to divert attention. It was in that scene of absolute precision that something impossible occurred. Through the internal intercom line, used daily for checklists and operational commands, a voice emerged. It wasn't a hiss, not interference. It was recitation in Arabic, clear, steady, without urgency. Each syllable had cadence, as if the sound didn't travel through cables or frequencies, but came from the very structure of the cockpit itself. Instinctively, I looked at the co-pilot. He kept his eyes on the instruments, showing no reaction. I casually asked if he was hearing anything out of the ordinary. "Nothing, Commander. Total silence." His reply was so calm it made me seem like the odd one, but what entered my ears was as real as any checklist read on a mission. In that instant I felt it wasn't just sound. Those words touched places in memory that had never been visited. There was no threat, no alarm. What spread was like hot water, gently burning away the guilt accumulated over years, the cold reports that omitted faces, the orders executed without question, the weight of decisions that passed through my hands without ever truly being mine. Time felt suspended. I kept adjusting controls, monitoring course and altitude, but inside, another cockpit was opening, an inner cockpit that didn't rely on altimeter or radar. There, the recitation made more sense than any order transmitted by satellite. When the sound ceased, the panel remained flawless, as if nothing had happened, no record in the systems, no sign of failure. Only I knew, only I had heard. I said nothing to the co-pilot. I wrote a short note in the logbook. Inner voice, parallel route. On landing, already on solid ground, my mind continued to reverberate with what I had heard. Before sleeping, I reached for the small book left in my bag. I found Surah Al-Ikhlas. Brief verses, concise, without embellishment. I read them softly, almost as if testing the memory. The impact was immediate. The same words that had echoed in flight were there, printed in simple letters. He is Allah, the One. It was as if the sky had spoken first, and then the paper confirmed it. There was no disguising the intimate recognition. It wasn't new knowledge. It felt more like a reunion with something my soul already knew, but my militarized mind had hidden. At that moment, I understood that true strength isn't measured in engine thrust or weapon range. Power was in the precision of that recitation. Without raising its voice, it dismantled castles of pride. Without arguments, it offered mercy. It was authority without the need for proof. I closed the book, but the phrase remained alive. I, who had been trained to react to any threat, realized it wasn't about reacting, but allowing that presence to speak in a language greater than any written order. The second sign didn't come to frighten me, but to align me. It brought the clarity that there was a parallel course, invisible to radars, but as real as the flight itself. And from that point on, I could no longer ignore that I was being led out of the narrative that had sustained my career. Presidential meeting rooms carry their own weight. The air feels denser, as if each word held the gravity of a decree. Digital maps projected borders, reports displayed costs calculated in figures, and risks assessed in percentages. There, voices were firm, trained to debate with surgical precision. Every gesture had protocol, every silence was strategic. But that day, something broke through the cold logic of those rooms. While generals and advisors adjusted details of an operation, my eyes drifted beyond the glass. The garden, still just minutes before, began to move in a singular way. The leaves of the trees, touched by a wind that didn't exist, aligned themselves to form an unmistakable pattern. I knew that geometry. It wasn't chance. It was unity. The word wasn't written in English, nor in technical language. It was like an invisible signature traced before me in the most protected space on Earth. I looked around, seeking to confirm if anyone else noticed, but everyone remained absorbed in tables, numbers, and justifications. No one turned their gaze. What unfolded beyond the window seemed reserved for me alone, as if the miracle had a unique address. Instinctively, I reached for my pocket, where I discreetly kept the small Quran translation. I didn't need to open it. It was enough to recognize the message already inside me. I didn't take a picture, didn't interrupt the meeting. I only recorded it within myself. It was as if a line had been drawn in that instant. Until then, I had served the machine. From then on, I began to serve conscience. The room remained the same, reports continued to be read, but within me a silent dividing line had formed. I began to see the collaterals differently. They were no longer figures of impact or predicted losses. They began to have names, stories, lives that could have been mine or anyone's. On subsequent trips, each stopover became an opportunity to hear what I had once ignored. Local crew members, maintenance technicians, even discreet airport staff began to share accounts that would never appear in official reports. I listened with unprecedented attention, as if receiving confidences of immeasurable worth. The discipline that had shaped my character gave way to another practice: repair. It wasn't about balancing statistics, but about restoring dignity through concrete gestures, a handshake given with humility, extra time taken to listen without hurry, a word of respect offered to those always invisible to the hierarchy, small acts that, within me, echoed louder than any decoration. I realized it wasn't necessary to change uniforms or roles to transform my path. The miracle I witnessed among those leaves taught me that true change happens inside, silent, without fanfare. There was no need for external proof. Conviction had already been planted. The days that followed confirmed that something within me had shifted for good. What once was routine, briefings, transfers, official trips, now became the stage for an inner struggle. I still followed protocols, but I wasn't moved by the same engines. I no longer sought to please superiors or defend narratives. I sought to align every gesture with the unity I had seen written in nature where no one else noticed. That discreet miracle, hidden in the very capital of power, was more transformative than medals, more eloquent than speeches. It didn't topple walls or interrupt meetings. It only opened a space within me, a space that could never be closed again. There, I understood, even in the center of decisions capable of altering the fate of millions, God finds ways to speak to those who need to hear. And when He speaks, it doesn't matter if there are cameras, witnesses, or records. The true archive is etched in the heart, and it cannot be erased. The military lodging room had grey walls and functional furniture, with nothing to indicate comfort beyond the strictly necessary. It was there, in that impersonal space, that I usually reviewed reports, organized uniforms, and stored the medals that represented 20 years of service. But that night, each decoration seemed to weigh more than ever. Those small metal plaques, polished to shine before cameras, reflected a story that no longer matched the one I carried in my chest. I opened the box, carefully. One by one, I looked at the symbols that once represented victories, promotions, missions accomplished. I realized that in truth many of them were stained with memories I didn't have the courage to name out loud. I remembered families who never knew why they suffered losses, maps covered with targets that became craters, flights where the narrative was glory, but the outcome was grief. And in that contrast, I decided I no longer wanted to hide the inner war that consumed me. I closed the door, turned off the phone, and without an audience bent my knees on the worn carpet of the room. The gesture, which seemed so simple, was harder than any aerial maneuver. The posture of submission was not part of the training I had received. My whole life had been shaped to keep my spine straight, to always look forward, to obey orders without bowing my head. But in that instant, lowering myself felt like releasing a weight I hadn't even known how to measure. I pronounced the Shahada in a firm yet quiet voice. The words came out naturally, as if they had been waiting for years at the back of my throat. There was no music, no flashes, no cinematic effect. There was only a silent order, like when critical systems return to normal after a failure. It was as if the entire aircraft of my life, until then flying in degraded mode, had regained stability without effort. I rose slowly, breathing differently. The walls were the same, the bed still narrow, the reports still on the table. But there was something new that no diploma or rank could translate. The reference that drove me was no longer the same. For the first time in decades, my loyalty was not anchored in the seal of the presidential office, in the flag raised at every base, or in the speeches that echoed in ceremonies. My first allegiance was, finally, to the Lord of the Worlds. That decision did not erase what I had done, nor did it dissolve the structure I was still part of, but it transformed the way I faced it. I still had duties, but now I answered to a higher authority. I still wore the uniform, but it was no longer the final layer of my identity. I still lived with protocols, but I no longer allowed them to be the ultimate compass of my conscience. In that silence, I realized I didn't need to announce anything right away. There are moments when the best testimony doesn't come from speeches, but from discrete practices repeated with consistency. I chose to keep it secret, not out of fear, but because I understood the system I lived in didn't accept course changes without a notum. There, a premature confession could be read as insubordination or even betrayal. So I chose to walk cautiously, letting transformation speak first through the way I lived, not through what I declared. The night went on, and I stayed seated, staring at the box of medals open before me. For the first time, they didn't define me. They were only objects that told part of a story, but didn't determine my destiny. There, in the simple room of a military lodging, I discovered a freedom no rank had ever granted me. It wasn't the freedom of abandoning duties, but the freedom of knowing my heart was no longer imprisoned by human power. I left the room a few hours later, uniform, impeccable, expression composed, as if nothing had changed. But inside me, everything had changed. I knew that from that moment on, every flight, every order received, every report read, would pass through the filter of a new loyalty, and there was no turning back. After that silent step taken in my quarters, I quickly realized that nothing would go unnoticed by those around me. There was no need to announce anything. The changes began to show naturally, as if the environment itself had sensed something had shifted. Interviews labeled routine came, conducted with the same coldness used to calibrate an onboard instrument. The questions were direct, but behind them lingered suspicion. Why was I more reserved, less interested in celebrations of prestige, and more attentive to details that once never bothered me? The flight schedules, once filled with missions tied to power, began to change. Without official explanation, I was removed from prestigious agendas, and little by little, invitations to events and meetings disappeared. The same system that had so often exalted me as a model of discipline now repositioned me cautiously, like relocating a piece that might no longer fit with the rest of the board. Outwardly, I kept the same tone, but inwardly, I understood. I was paying the price for a transformation no one had authorized. If on one hand I lost access to places where decisions were treated like spectacle, on the other I received tasks that revealed an entirely different world. Humanitarian flights came, carrying doctors to remote regions, food to save entire families, children displaced by wars they hadn't chosen. The cockpit, once a stage for rigid protocols and heavy gazes, became the space for a lighter and, at the same time, truer mission. I remember one boarding in particular. A group of refugees climbed the improvised ramp, carrying cloth bags in their hands, and in their eyes, the marks of a path no one would ever want to walk. A little girl, no older than 8, approached me before entering the aircraft aisle. With simplicity, she held my wrist for a moment and said just one word: brother. There was no way to interpret that as coincidence. In that gesture, I understood something no medal or position could ever give me: belonging. With each trip, I felt further from the gala halls and closer to a truth that needed no spotlight. I discovered it wasn't the uniform that gave me identity, but the intention behind each act of service. I understood that true power isn't in commanding global strategies, but in holding a hand, easing suffering, carrying hope to a safe destination. The contrast between the two worlds became clear. One fed on speeches and prestige, the other on simplicity and sincerity. On those discreet routes, without the pomp of presidential missions, I realized my path had been reorganized around a higher command. It was as if the three signs, the light that chose me, the recitation in the midst of technical silence, and the design of unity no one else saw, had closed a perfect circuit. They weren't scattered pieces, but complementary messages pointing in the same direction. There, without public announcement, I understood that the true chain of command was not at the top of human hierarchies, but above them. Yes, I lost the spotlight. Invitations disappeared. Honors ceased. The looks of prestige turned into caution. But at the same time, I gained something I never imagined finding inside the very structure that had shaped me so many times: peace. Not the peace that appears in slogans or diplomatic reports, but the kind that settles within us when we know each step is no longer guided by fear of others' opinions, but by a quiet loyalty to the truth that found us. In practice, it was an exchange. Fewer spotlights, more direction. Fewer speeches about greatness, more living of mercy. Less blind obedience, more awakened conscience. Without fanfare, I realized that serving without applause was the greatest royalty one could achieve. And on this new course, I discovered that being at peace with the truth is worth more than any position in the halls of power. With each new dawn, what once seemed like routine gained new weight. I no longer wake up to fulfill military protocols or prepare flight reports, but to align my heart with prayer. I learned to pray with consistency, step by step, like someone relearning to walk after years of running on autopilot. I discovered that it isn't speed that sustains faith, but calm discipline. Before God, there is no urgency, there is surrender. Studying the Quran became part of my daily life, not with the rush of someone seeking immediate answers, but with the humility of one who accepts that each word carries a universe. Before, I read aerial maps with obsession. Now I study verses with reverence, and I see that both require attention. While one guided me through physical routes, the other guides me through inner ones. The first took me to destinations of power. The second leads me to destinations of peace. Turning guilt into practical repair is perhaps the greatest lesson of this new stage. Before, I brushed past people in a hurry, as if my schedule mattered more than any life around me. Now, I offer time. I listen to stories that add nothing to my resume, but heal old wounds in those who tell them. I seek out those I hurt with harsh or ironic words and ask forgiveness. I relearned the language of a glance, a hug, the simple gesture that restores dignity. It is not about balancing statistics of destruction with individual acts. It is not mathematics. It is reconciliation. I carry with me the weight of decisions that affected lives I never knew. I know I cannot rewrite the past, but I can write the present differently. Each small act of repair is like a piece restored to its right place, a silent course correction measured only by the heart. Today, I also put my skills at the service of those who once would have been invisible to me. Technical knowledge, once reserved for state operations, is now applied in relief missions, transport of supplies, and assistance to forgotten communities. I discovered that my hands were not trained only to pilot aircraft on routes of power, but to sustain paths of hope. I write these words not as someone seeking recognition, but as someone who knows many still live armored within. I speak to you who may carry the same shell of pride I once carried. There is purer air outside that armor. It takes courage to breathe without a mask, but the freedom that comes after cannot be compared to anything the world can offer. That's why I also leave a subtle request. If this story touched your life, if it awakened reflection in you or brought comfort, consider supporting this work with super thanks. That contribution is not just numbers. It keeps alive the possibility that stories like mine reach other people who may be suffocating in silence. It sustains a work that reaches hearts I could never reach alone. Every gesture of support, no matter how small it seems, is like invisible fuel that allows this channel to keep existing and carrying forward accounts of transformation. Just as an aircraft cannot stay in the air without fuel, a message cannot keep reaching without support. If you feel it is worthwhile, know that this help will be used to multiply reach and keep alive the bridge between personal experiences and the ears that need them. My gratitude today is not limited to words. It is expressed in commitment. Commitment to continue learning, to continue serving, to continue sharing the truth that reached me. Commitment not to return to the silence that once imprisoned me, but to use every opportunity to show there is life beyond the armor. And if together we can carry this even further, then every step will have been worth it. Life has taught me that the greatest changes don't always happen in battles or official speeches. Many times they arise in the silence of a moment, in an unexpected phrase, in a detail that seemed small but suddenly opens an entire horizon. That's how it was with me. Between flights and reports, I discovered that a simple breath can alter the course of an entire existence. So I leave a sincere request. If something you heard here sparked a flame inside you, don't hide it. Share this video in groups and on social media. For you, it may be just another click, but for the one who receives it, it may be the turning point they were waiting for. We never know in whose heart a word will land, or whose life may be strengthened by it. My story shows that you don't need to be a president, a general, or the pilot of a great plane to live profound transformations. All it takes is a single minute of true listening. Between decision rooms and long nights of flying, I realized that 1 minute can correct decades of a poorly drawn course. It can restore hope, renew strength, even save someone who saw no way out. If this message brought something of value to you, don't keep it only as a memory. Let it travel farther, cross borders, and reach others who may be in the same silence I once was. And if you'd like to keep walking this path with me, stay tuned. Watch the next video. There you will find new reflections that may add even more to your own journey. May each word find its place, and may the peace that reached me also reach you.